Alright, here's my latest pillow talk. Tesla's tri-metal generator. So little information on something, it makes you wonder if it's even conceivably possible to figure it out, and I think I just figured it out. Unfortunately, my reference or citation has nothing to do with science, it has to do with the I Ching. In the theory section, they say when something becomes extreme enough, it flips into its opposite. Well, you know what batteries do that. Sometimes certain batteries are known to invert their polarity if they get too drained. I believe that was the case with nickel metal hydride. That's why you're not supposed to allow nickel metal hydride to get drained all the way to zero. And so the manufacturer tries to prevent that by putting in a little safety catch in there so that it never reaches zero and reverses polarity on you. Well, I say that because it's the electric field, not the EMF field, not the electromagnetic field, but the electric field that counters the magnetic field. In other words, there's no such thing as back EMF, counter EMF. Lenz Effect pertains strictly to the electric field alone, which we know is voltage, and the magnetic field is amperage. So it's the electric field that is countering the magnetic field, and not both countering themselves. Because Edward Leedskalnin had already figured out that magnetism is a perpetual motion when you get a perpetual motion holder, such as he managed to do, and it's the amperage that's running in perpetuity inside that magnetizable piece of horseshoe iron, made into a circuit with the help of a bar across the north and south feet of that horseshoe magnetized piece of iron. But now we put an electric loop, a wire looped to itself, going through that toroidal magnetic field, and now we've got the basis of Barbosa and Leal, Earth Captor. Well, the perpetual motion holder never has back EMF. It doesn't even know what to do with back EMF. If there was any back EMF in a magnetic field, it happens only when it gets released, as opposed to when it's put in. But with the electric field, the problem seems to be that it's trying to release it right away all on its own. Nobody told it to release anything, and so its back EMF or counter force is right away, as opposed to later on. And so with a magnetic field, you get this, you put off the so-called back EMF. It doesn't happen the same time as does the electric field, which is right away. The minute you give it some electricity, it wants to counteroppose you right away. Not so with the magnetic field. The magnetic field waits until the magnetic field is released before it creates anything in reverse direction. Anyway, getting to the point here, that's just looking at mechanics, but the reason for this video is that Tesla's special generator, what did he say? For every 200 pounds of iron added to his device, 1 horsepower output is added. Okay? That's a very big clue, but it's not enough on its own. What I learned from rethinking about electricity with Barbosa and Leal is that the electric field behaves differently than the magnetic field, or else we wouldn't have two components, both of them in toroidal loops, if there wasn't a reason to separate them. One is the magnetic keeper, and the other is the electric keeper, but the electric keeper is not much of a keeper. Especially since it's tied into the magnetic keeper, now it starts to have an impact on the magnetic keeper as well, some of its own influence. But if it wasn't for the electric keeper, the magnetic field of the magnetic keeper would go on indefinitely. There's no reason for it to do anything except keep going around inside itself. So Edward Leeds Cullen, I don't want to say married to, but in conjunction with the Barbosa and Leal, those two groups of individuals gives us the predicate for trying to understand Tesla's trimetal generator, his special generator. Forget the trimetals for the moment. I still don't know what that has to do with anything. I think that's just an extra feature, his special generator. Let's see. Where was I getting to? Because Tesla said to add more iron, which is a magnetizable substance. It could be anything, but in this case it's iron because that's what they had in those days. Add more iron to increase the horsepower. Why? To overwhelm the so-called back EMF, which is not back EMF, it is back EF, because that's what we're going to get right away, is a counter electric field. The counter magnetic field is not going to happen until much later when the thing releases it. But what if it's a DC system? You ain't going to release it. It's just, you can keep adding, but it's not going to release it until you stop adding more than what you added before. It's like karma. One way to avoid karma is to keep simply doing what you're doing, just do more of it. And the reaction will never hit you. Will never see the light of day. It'll never come up. It'll never arise. But keep doing more of what you've already been doing, and you'll never have to pay the consequence. That's the situation with karma. So now we got a situation from the Bible, and the Bible's quote is, why do bad things happen to good people and bad people get away with murder? Because they keep escalating what they're doing, and it doesn't have to be a bad person. It could be anybody, a good person. You keep escalating, or a neutral person. You keep escalating what you're doing, the type of karma. And that particular type of karma never sees the light of day. It never comes back to you, in other words. You just keep putting it out, more of it, and you create a pressure that's greater than the pressure of the prior karma of that type. And that greater pressure prevents the prior karma of lesser pressure to come back, turn around, and reach you. Okay? So Mother Nature's creation is this big, huge circuit, and everything comes back to the author, provided you let it. But if you keep building up pressure, it can't. Okay? So, where were we? So if you keep adding more iron to the system, you end up boosting a magnetic field that never returns to kick you back. Okay? But the electric field will. In the circuit portion of your overall circuit, but the magnetic field of the magnetic portion, namely in the iron, doesn't, because it just keeps soaking it up. It never reaches saturation. There's no reason for a capacitor to discharge unless it reaches maximum threshold and breaks down, or you stop applying the charge and you relax the charge that you're applying, and then the discharge starts to happen. Well, it's like that with a, I don't know, which one are we on now? With a magnetic field, because, wait a minute, no, that's voltage in a capacitor. Well, a capacitor, though, is not a piece of wire. See, that's the difference. It's kind of an insulator in there. So now a capacitor behaves the same way a magnetic keeper behaves, except that a magnetic keeper allows the magnetism to flow while a capacitor stops its flow. And that's the only way to get the same result, is that they behave differently within their respective fields, the magnetic field versus the electric field, the amperage versus the voltage. So what I'm trying to say here is that you've created an imbalance if all you do is keep adding iron, which oddly enough you could do with the electrostatic field with voltage if you kept adding dielectric and block the flow. But right now we're dealing with Tesla special generators, so you keep adding iron and you never get a magnetic rebound, a reflex. You just keep soaking it up. Meanwhile, you're getting all your electric rebound, just not the magnetic. So you create an imbalance, an asymmetry, which can stand to your advantage. Because all of that magnetic influence that's not rebounding can overwhelm the electric field, which has already been rebounding and releasing its rebound consistently over time as you applied it, the EMF force. You've got a filtration going on here in which you're stuck with magnetic potential and none in the electric. And that magnetic potential can be so great as to overwhelm the electric and give you a situation that has absolutely no resistance. It's practically a superconductor because there's no rebound anymore to the electric. The electric is what we're going to harness, right? Because we need voltage to run our devices. We may drain amperage out of a source of energy, but ultimately it's the voltage that's going to be affected by that drain on the amperage, and it's that drop in voltage that will signal the end to the flow of amperage, and then our load can't be supported anymore, the load that we're supplying electricity for. So it's like a silliness. Where am I going with this? I know there's something here. I can smell a fish. And boy, do I smell one. The original idea was that you don't get any back EF if you get sufficient back MF to overwhelm the EF such that it can't counter anything, because the forward MF drags what would have been the back EF along in the opposite direction, or just holds on to it with a strangle noose. But I think it would, what I was getting at, what I was thinking about, was that it reverses, it inverts the back EF to get it to move forward rather than backwards, so that you get no counter any force. It's all forward force. And that might seem like free energy, but it's not free energy. It's just energy you're not throwing. You're not even throwing it away, because normally counterforce competes with you. So you don't have that competition anymore, let alone the loss. And you get it to work in your favor the simplest way possible, without anything complicated, really. Simply add more massive iron. It's the simplest concept around. You've got your circuit, you got your wires and your coil, but your coil should be very little mass, and the only way to do that is to make sure it's ultra thin, and you don't pass too much amperage through it to fry it or vaporize it. You simply pass voltage through it. You set up a dipole inside your coil. That means you can't get any counter effect. So there's two things you have to do. See, I knew something was missing from the story. You add more iron to the system because that's where you're going to put your magnetic force. But you try to minimize and reduce the amount of copper because you want to eliminate the counter electric force by having very little massive copper to carry or allow to carry the counter-electric force. So you get very little counter-electric force, you get a maximum of magnetic force going in the forward direction because it hasn't been released yet, so there's no reason for it to produce anything counter, and you end up with nothing countering you. Oh boy. How are you supposed to run anything? Because the coil of wire is looped upon itself. The coil of wire is looped upon itself. It connects with itself. Just like, this is why I was beginning to think that Barbosa and Leal is part and parcel to Tesla's special generator. That the coil of wire, you know it's going to be there, right, is connected to itself. And there's nothing else in it. Nothing that would compete or offer resistance. Now we know from Barbosa and Leal there are two types of connections you have to make with that coil of wire in order to specialize how you work with it. You don't just connect your coil. You connect it back to itself, and you do two connections. You do a loose coupling to provide for transference of amperage, inductively transfer. And then you do a voltage shunt, a single wire shunt, to equalize voltages to your power circuits. Your power circuit is separate from your coil, your secondary from your secondary coil. So you have three different circuits. You've got your primary, which in the case of the U-boat, the Nazi U-boat, is simply the reciprocating piston. That's your primary. It's a substitute for the primary coil. That's what you're using to put energy into the system. Your secondary coil is looped upon itself, so that doesn't even connect directly with the power circuit, the load circuit. And then you have the load circuit, which is coupled to the secondary loosely two ways, really, because you get a voltage shunt, which is not a true, sorry, my nose keeps itching, a voltage shunt, and a loose coupling for your amperage. So it's a special generator because you've divided your coils up, your circuits up into three different circuits: your primary, your secondary, and your load. And that's exactly probably what Nathan Stubblefield did in his so-called Earth battery, which is really an Earth collector. Is you have to separate your circuit into three circuits. You know, this is far beyond DC circuits where you just have one circuit. The primary and the secondary and the load are all smushed together into one circuit. I'm sorry, this must be nervous. So it's special because you specialize. See, Tesla, you must be playing a word game with us. It's a special generator because you specialize every single aspect of the system by subdividing into three different divisions: primary, secondary, and load. Three different circuits. And they're each isolated from each other, for the most part. And then you don't get back EMF influencing your load, or your source for that matter, because it's right there in the middle in the secondary. So the only place where it could happen is in the secondary. And if it happens in the load, it's all the more power to you, because then that'll reduce the need for energy coming from your supply vis-a-vis the secondary. But you get your primary amperage reduced practically to zero, and so you have strictly voltage. So that means you need a high frequency. That's right, you need a high frequency in your primary, high voltage, low amperage. Isn't Tesla known for that? And then your secondary is looped upon itself. It doesn't go to the load. It just goes to itself. This is what we've been missing all this time. Hey, Barbosa and Leal, you two guys are not jerks. You know your stuff. You've figured out Tesla's special generator. because you've eliminated back EMF the easiest way possible by incorporating Edward Leeds Collins's perpetual motion holder and by looping the secondary upon itself and and what? You know why the amperage is reduced in the secondary? Wait a minute, I said to reduce it in the primary. It's reduced in the secondary as well, in a sense, because it sees no load. All it sees is the resistance of the copper wire, which doesn't amount to a whole lot. Silver has even less than copper, so maybe we should be using silver wire instead of copper wire for the electric keeper, for the secondary, for the wire that's looped upon itself. Be that as it may, it sees no resistance, and so it sees no load, and so it's kind of like, well, then there's no back EMF there either to speak of. So in the primary, it's strictly voltage oriented, so there's no back EMF there. The secondary sees no load, so there's no back EMF there. The magnetic keeper doesn't reach saturation of magnetizable mass, so it never has a chance to become a counter force. It just keeps soaking up the more magnetic force you put in it. It just keeps soaking up more of it. And the load, and whatever counter forces the load provides, is in your favor, because that's the direction you want it to go, to recharge your source. Oh my God, you end up recharging your... Oh my God. This is what I envisioned when I bought my electric car, to come up with a means and a method in which your load powers your source, which is the wrong choice of words, but that was the only choice I had available at the time. It recharges your source. Oh my God, this is better than the best. No wonder it's his special generator. Unbelievable. Oh my God. How can you go wrong with anything like this? Now, if your load is recharging your source, don't you think the load is powering your whole circuit at this point? Whether or not you had batteries at the source to reclaim any of it, because you don't. If you have the U-boats of the Nazi U-boats, well, you would need batteries to start the system, so okay, so you top them off. You don't need many. How much do you need to start the system, really? This is a perfect arrangement. But it's more complicated than what we were told by William Line. So I knew there was missing elements, but the problem is, where do you collect the information to figure out the remaining pieces that are missing? You have to reinvent the wheel, and you have to wait around for somebody to do it for you, because I'm not smart enough to. But this is the answer to the problem. So effectively, you could say Barbosa and Leal did it without any help from anybody, and I'm just, giving them credit, that's all. But I'm putting emphasis where it's needed. The magnetic keeper of Barbosa and Leal, it stands to reason, could be enlarged upon. Because think about it, the Earth is that magnetic keeper too, right? It's very large, right? It's got a lot of horsepower, right? Because you need a lot of grounding rods to connect to it, right? But you've also got toroids, transformer cores, in your circuit, in your Barbosa and Leal circuit, to collect this stuff, So, wouldn't it stand to reason to enlarge them? The mass? Uh-oh. I used to claim that the magnetic keeper portion of Tesla's special generator should be magnetically coupled to the hull of the U-boat to incorporate the U-boat into the magnetic keeper, even though only the magnetic keeper has the wires wound on it. What if the toroids of Barbosa and Leal are somehow magnetically coupled directly to the Earth? How would we do that? I thought we already did with the Captor loop. You may be right. That might be how it's done. Maybe that's the only way to do it. I just thought a direct coupling was required. No, wait a second. You're trying to say it's more efficient to bind those toroids to an iron post that goes deep into the bedrock? As far down as you can send it? Such that it would matter, as far as it would matter. Directly. Then you don't need 56 grounding rods. Because when you think about it, the Captor loop is a loose coupling, and that's not even to the magnetic keeper, that's to the electric wire that goes through the magnetic keeper. Barbosa and Leal might have had a better way. See, I just assumed the magnetic keeper would be directly connected to the hull of the ship, the U-boat. Nathan Stubblefield did it a little differently. He put two rods a few feet apart, not too much, connected to a loop of wire above ground to pick up his Earth-based telephony. It doesn't sound much different than an electric keeper in a sense. Coupled to the Earth, in this case being the magnetic keeper. You know what? He might have been using the same principle. Magnetic keeper coupled to an electric keeper. Yeah, I've been suspecting Nathan Stubblefield was doing something similar. So I think all three people are doing the same thing. They're just doing it in their own way. But the important distinction is the Lenz effect is not the same in the electric field versus the magnetic field. They're two separate considerations and they behave differently. Ultimately, they behave the same. Over the long span of time, but in the short span of time, they behave very differently. And that asymmetry is what we take advantage of. The asymmetry between the electric field and the magnetic field. Hey, they're already separated by 90 degrees, right? How can they possibly behave the same? They have to be the same field to behave the same. The fact that they're separated by 90 degrees, isn't that the most drastic separation? Angular separation is 90 degrees. I mean, they put two people, if they want to stimulate conversation at a table, you seat them at the corner of the table. Not facing each other, not sitting side by side, but wrapped around the corner. In astrology, the quadrant is the strongest relationship you can pick. The square relationship, the squaring of a circle. And of course in electricity they keep talking about a quarter wave. Tuning a circuit to the quarter wave of what you're working with. So obviously there's something there to the quadrant that's very significant. in terms of bringing about a distinction between the two, a dissimilarity that's not oppositional, because if it's oppositional, you end up with nothing. It neutralizes itself. So instead you get distinct characteristics that are highly unique and asymmetrical as a consequence. Okay, it's pretty cool. Alright, here is my maybe final analysis of Barbosa and Leal. I've always suspected that the grounding rod sets up an electrostatic field in what we are told has to be a strong geomagnetic field in order to operate. Otherwise you have to make up the difference with more grounding rods at the receiving end connected to the captor loop. So what we've got in the electric keeper is a flow of amperage, and it's not the quantity that matters, it's just the fact that there's no resistance, and it loops upon itself, so it just keeps going. It's movement, and it's backed by, let's see, it's backed by actually high frequency voltage modified by the neon bulb that's shunted to it. In any case, we've got a huge magnetic keeper in the earth. Now, what's magnetism? According to Donald Smith, it's amperage. But we apply to the earth an electrostatic field. What's electrostatic? It's voltage. Now, we know from simple electromagnetic theory that if we put voltage behind amperage, we get the amperage to move. So that's what we're doing. We're causing the 115 volts coming out of the AC inverter in Clarence's replication to induce movement of the amperage to come out of the earth and travel up the captor grounding line, the grounding neutral. Now, it won't move, right? Unless we have that electric keeper that it's inductively coupled to, the secondary. And because that's moving without any resistance, because it just goes back upon itself, that movement is the signature that we want. We want movement of the amperage. The amperage is latent in the earth, just like it's latent in a magnetic keeper. And this has been the problem of how to harvest the amperage stored in a magnetic keeper. So we use one magnetic keeper, the toroids, within Clarence's replication, the toroids, to induce movement of amperage in the electric keeper. And the motion of amperage in the electric keeper induces movement of amperage to come out of the earth and power the load. So it's a little complicated. How to harvest amperage from a magnetic keeper. And you might as well use something big. Well, in the case of the Nazi U-boat, it was the hull of the ship. The common ground. It wasn't earth ground. It was the common ground of the mass of the iron in the hull of the ship. But in the case of the Barbosa and Leal, it's the earth. But everything else is the same, except the primary coil on Barbosa and Leal is replaced in Tesla's special generator with the reciprocating piston. That's the only difference. The compressed air driving the reciprocating piston it replaces the primary coil. But everything else is the same. So whatever I thought before how Tesla did his special generator is overruled by how Barbosa and Leal does it, because that's the only way to do it. It's just they do it conceptually the same, but they do it in particular slightly different because it's a different situation. So if you had a vehicle, I don't know how you would do it without avoiding iron and trying to make your vehicle lightweight, by turning to aluminum chassis, like a Tesla motor makes their car, electric car, with an aluminum chassis. I don't think you could get away with it. And I don't think you could just merely put an aluminum plate on the back end, because the whole point is you need a mass of iron, which in the case of, but it's two different masses. One are the toroids that initiates movement, and the other is the source of your amperage, which is either the hull of the U-boat or the mass of the Earth, in the Tesla special generator versus Barbosa and Leal's Earth captor, respectively. So you would need the Pierce Arrow from 1931 was a huge car. It wasn't this tiny little thing. It wasn't a Volkswagen, Volkswagen. It was a big, massive luxury car with a lot of iron in the chassis, because it was meant to have a big engine, a gasoline engine in it. So it was perfect. It had the mass of iron to serve as common ground, to replace earth ground, to replace the hull of the, to be common ground, to serve as the equivalent of the hull of a U-boat. So there was no aluminum plate on the back end of the car. There was an antenna, to be connected to the so-called neon bulb, the so-called, I hate the phrase they use. I just want to call it a chaotic, disruptive discharge. That's what they call it. A spark is a disruptive discharge. How about just call it chaotic spark? Anyway, that's what the neon bulb does, and would be connected to the radio antenna of the car. You can't connect it to the car itself, because that's your common ground. And there's no aluminum plate on the back end like Clarence thought there might be, because there's no need for one. The whole chassis is your common ground. It's provided it's made out of iron, steel, whatever, something magnetizable. Magnetizable iron. Nice and heavy. Nice and massive. So this means the car would have had its lead-acid battery retained. It would have been necessary to keep it, because you got to have something to work your system, to initiate it. But it's this differentiation between the electric field and the magnetic field that means you can eventually store up enough charge in the common ground of the chassis of the Pierce Arrow car that you can drive the engine. Drive the motor. Yeah, it's like you warm up a car, you just warm it up till you get enough charge going so that you can drive. So now your magnetic keeper becomes your capacitance, so to speak, that you have to wait till it builds up the proper, wait a second, that's not volts, is it? No, this is where electrical common parlance gets turned on its head. It's not voltage we're trying to build up here. It's the amperage in the magnetizable common ground, or earth ground, which is already there to begin with in the case of the earth, but it has to be built up, has to be applied and built up in the case of a common ground, such as the chassis of the Pierce Arrow 1931 car. When that gets built up, so you're driving around with a magnetic field base. Well, no. It's a magnetic keeper. That means it's not a magnetic field. Yet, when you harvest it, it becomes one. So yeah, it would be a magnetic field. That's right. Wouldn't it? Not necessarily, because you're using an electrostatic field to squeeze out its amperage. So the chassis of the car should not be creating a magnetic field. Okay. I mean, the Earth already has a magnetic field, but we don't know if it's coming from from the Earth. It could be coming from the core. And we say that, but what if the Earth is hollow? So then the core is not really transferring the magnetic field directly coupled to the shell of the Earth. It's just coming out of the core, traveling through empty space to reach past the shell and continue out into outer space to create the Van Allen radiation belt surrounding the Earth. Okay, so the Earth is not creating the magnetic field. It's the core separate from the Earth with a huge space in between that's creating the magnetic field that we experience on the surface of the planet, which we, it's not coming from the magma deep underground. It's coming from the core, at the center, what do they call it? The geophysical center of the Earth. It's not the center because it's not directly coupled to the Earth anyway. Not physically coupled anyway. Okay.